Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to the Political Forum. Today is September 1st. And for the last 6 months, we've been meeting via Zoom. And if you look back to our past events, it seems like we've been discussing quite a bit regarding the ongoing pandemic, as well as the civil unrest that erupted after the George Floyd killing. And it seems like a lot of what we talked about for the last 6 months, which, very productive and interesting, but it was a lot of domestic affairs. And sure, domestic affairs are important on an election year. However, as we approach a new month of September, I think we should also take a look at what's going on around the world. It's important to understand our place right now in this world relative to what's going on in other parts of the world. And usually when we deal with international relations, that the product of it is a bilateral relations, sometimes the rippling effects are not just limited to the two signatories. You have other, the implications could certainly linger on for other states in the region. And that's certainly no exception for a treaty that Israel has entered into with one of its Gulf state neighbors. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Yes, it's a bilateral deal, but sometimes these deals have a tremendous level of implications geopolitically for its neighbors. So with that being said, I'm going to turn over to Ralph, who will give us a presentation on this topic. And after that, I will ask some questions based on his presentation. And then that will be followed by questions from the audience. And what we'll do is when we get to the audience part, we just ask that you use the app function where you could just simply raise your hand from the participant's profile. And we'll try to get as many questions as possible. So at this time, if you could please put your audio on mute so that Ralph could give his presentation uninterrupted, that would be great. So over to you, Ralph.
Okay. First, I'd like to thank Thomas for asking me to introduce the subject and providing those helpful links. The link that I found most interesting was the last one from Al Jazeera, which was a fairly comprehensive survey of international reactions, including much of the Arab world, several countries in Europe, people in Israel, the US, and even among American Jews. My basic reaction is in line with those of J Street, the left liberal Jewish activist group and lobby that supports a two-state peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians, and from the Biden campaign. Both welcomed the agreement, and especially the part in which Israel has agreed to temporarily set aside any imminent plan to unilaterally annex territory within the West Bank. And both hope that this temporary break on such a move would become permanent. This seems like a done deal, with the only possible fly in the ointment being if the Emiratis insist upon a public commitment by Israel not to annex parts of the West Bank for a given length of time. This could cause a political dilemma for Netanyahu, who has recently run on a platform plank that pledges to annex the Jordan Valley and/or other West Bank territory. But Netanyahu would likely have no problem making such a commitment in a secret side letter. Interestingly, since the Trump administration wants this deal to go through, at the very least to tout it as an achievement that helps their re-election effort, they seem to be restraining Israel from any rapid move toward annexation. I know a lot more about Israel than the United Arab Emirates, but I've learned that the Emirates has about 10 million in population, with fewer than 2 million being citizens. Most are people from South Asia, Indians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, and a few other places who came there to work. Israel has about 9 million citizens, of whom 75 to 80% are Jews, and most of the others are Arabs. In addition, there are about 5 million Palestinian Arabs who live under the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Hamas in the Gaza Strip. But whose lives are severely restricted by Israel's military occupation and by the presence on the West Bank of nearly 500,000 Jews whom we know as settlers. But these include families who have lived there for 3 generations. There obviously was a Trump administration role encouraging the deal, but relations between Israel, the UAE, and other Gulf states have been an open secret for quite some time. So Trump, Kushner, and Pompeo may not have had to work very hard. Both the US and the UAE want to facilitate a sale of top-of-the-line F-35 fighter planes to the UAE. A formal treaty with Israel would likely help that happen by softening Israel's opposition and that of Israel's supporters in the US. By the way, the most numerous supporters of hardline or hard-nosed Israeli positions toward the Palestinians and Iran are not most American Jews, but rather evangelical Christians. And this is why the Trump administration centers its Israel policies to curry favor with this voting bloc, which is a lot larger than American Jews. Most American Jews very much support Israel's existence and its security, but since 70 to 75% are liberals or even further left, most American Jews are uneasy with harsh positions taken by Israeli governments that have been led by Benjamin Netanyahu over the past 11 years. They were more comfortable with the peace-oriented coalitions led by Yitzhak Rabin, Shimon Peres, Ehud Barak, and Ehud Olmert in the early 1990s and most of the early 2000s. Israel's been quietly engaged with Arab Gulf countries for years, even including a visit to Oman by Prime Minister Netanyahu in 2018. You know, a problem with this map is that the designations are in Arabic. You know, so, okay. There's a corner, there's a corner of the map which is the UAE. It's a small corner of the Arabian Peninsula, and this is Israel, of course, and this is a line that connects the two. Anyway, getting back to my notes here, the new regime in Sudan has publicly. Well, okay, so Netanyahu and Israel has had a growing relationship, unofficial, with Gulf Arab countries for quite some time. And I mentioned that Netanyahu visited Oman in 2018. The new regime in Sudan has publicly hinted at making peace with Israel. I've heard that their main incentive is to get off the US and Western list of terrorist supporting regimes. And this could be a means of doing that. Rumor has it that Bahrain and Oman, and possibly even Morocco in North Africa, may follow suit in short order. Saudi Arabia is said to be looking on approvingly, but it is not yet ready to risk the wrath of its ultra-conservative Muslim clergy to take the plunge. Winners and losers. The Gulf states would strengthen their alliance with Israel to counter the aggressive policies of Iran, making more overt the covert alliance that already exists. Taken as a whole, most Arabs in the region hate this deal, including most people in Egypt and Jordan, which have long-standing peace treaties, but remain largely hostile toward Israel. Still, their governments have indicated support for the agreement, mostly because of its halt to any immediate annexations in the West Bank, which is a major component of the deal. In its immediate aftermath, it may make Palestinians less likely to return to negotiations out of their anger over what they see as betrayal by the UAE. And it weakens the Palestinian bargaining position because it begins to remove a bargaining chip they had, which is the belief, no longer evident, that Israel needs a peace agreement with the Palestinians to further normalize relations with the Arab world. The peace camp in Israel is weakened for the same reason, that Israel will be obtaining normalized relations with an additional Arab country and possibly more, despite not having achieved a final peace agreement with the Palestinians. And Netanyahu undercuts his frenemies in the Blue and White Party. Formerly, these were Netanyahu's main moderate opposition, because Blue and White entered into Netanyahu's mostly right-wing coalition, partially to block any imminent annexation of West Bank Palestinian territory, as Netanyahu had promised his voters. Now this rationale or excuse for Blue and White being in Netanyahu's government has been undercut. Paradoxically, this also weakens Netanyahu with far-right voters and parties who favor immediate annexation. This new Blue and White Party didn't exist until 2019, when Israel's recent spate of 3 consecutive elections began. And Israel's just narrowly averted a possible 4th election in November. Blue and White is currently Israel's 2nd largest party, but probably not for long. Its leader's sudden decision to join Netanyahu's government immediately caused it to split in half. Israel's almost unique system of proportional representation makes it virtually impossible for any one party to win an election with a majority of seats in parliament. So it requires coalitions of several parties or blocs to form a government. Governments have to be coalitions, so placating very small interest groups, such as ultra-Orthodox Jews or nationalistic settlers, becomes very important. And this system also makes for the sudden emergence of new parties, which has been happening with dizzying frequency. For example, a centrist force, Kadima, which is Hebrew for forward, became the governing party under Prime Ministers Sharon and Olmert, almost destroying Likud, the leading right-wing party in the early 2000s. Yet it was Kadima that disappeared entirely in 2015. In that year, Labor, traditionally the leading party of the center-left and Israel's ruling party for its first 3 decades, came close to unseating Netanyahu. Yet today, Labor is on the verge of totally disappearing. And I rather think it will not survive the next election. I'd like to discuss further the dynamics of Israeli politics, mostly having to do with the bloc of Arab parties in Israel. In the past few years, a major political force has emerged among Arab citizens of Israel, a bloc of 4 parties called the Joint List, which is now the 3rd largest party in Israel's parliament. Most Arab voters now support this bloc, and a small but growing minority of Jews on the left vote for the Joint List as well. Currently, one of its 15 members of parliament is a Jewish Israeli leftist. The one remaining left-wing party with some viability, that is the one remaining left-wing party with a Jewish majority, Meretz, also has some Arab support, and it may possibly join the Joint List in a future election. The political and cultural divide between most Israeli Jews and most of its Arab citizens is far more severe than it was in the 1990s, when Rabin and Barak owed their terms in office as prime ministers to the pivotal support of Israeli Arabs. If all of Israel's many opposition parties in the last election had agreed, a tiny majority of the parliament, 61 out of 120 seats, could have formed a new government without Netanyahu as prime minister. Traditionally, there is resistance among both Arab and Jewish politicians to this degree of cooperation. But in this case, most of the Jewish party leaders didn't want to go there. This would not have been a stable coalition with so many parties in a government that could have fallen with a defection of 1 or 2 members of the Knesset, but it might have remained in power long enough to make sure that Netanyahu finally goes to trial on the 3 major corruption charges that he's been indicted for without the temporary immunity that he's negotiated for himself. In my opinion, this should have been their agenda. And from that, maybe Arabs and Jews in Israel could have learned that they could trust each other better in their common country. Thomas suggested that I compare the new peace deal with Israel's treaties with Egypt and Jordan. So I'll conclude with this. The Egyptian and Jordanian peace treaties, 1979 and 1994 respectively, formally ended their state of war with Israel. Both involved Israel ceding territory. In the case of Egypt, Israel withdrew from the entire Sinai Peninsula, captured during the Six-Day War of June 1967. Egypt refused to take back the Gaza Strip, which Egypt had held under military occupation since 1948, when it invaded the former Palestinian Mandate territory in an unsuccessful effort to destroy Israel at its birth. Israel had held the Sinai and Gaza Strip briefly as a result of the 1956 Sinai War and the Suez Crisis, but it returned those territories to Egypt in 1957 without a peace treaty at that time. The treaty with Jordan included a minor adjustment of the border along the Jordan River. By contrast, the UAE has never been at war with Israel and is nowhere near Israel's borders. The two countries are 1,270 miles apart as the crow flies, with transport by a land route adding another 300 miles. Even though there hasn't yet been a ratified peace treaty, commercial air links are being initiated even as we speak, and the UAE has formally ended its participation in the official Arab League economic boycott of Israel, which they increasingly hadn't been observing anyway. Emirati and Israeli business people have visited each other. Some even speak the other's language. They are chomping at the bit for ties to be fully normalized. By contrast, Egypt and Jordan have what is known as a cold peace with Israel, with few commercial and personal ties. But Egypt in particular values a close relationship with Israel's military because both share common threats from ISIS and other Islamist extremists. Hamas is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood movement, and we should remember that when the Egyptian military overthrew President Mohammed Morsi in 2013, they were overthrowing a government controlled by the Muslim Brotherhood. I've heard that Egyptian intellectuals are beginning to warm up to Israel in recognition of the fact that both are battling branches of the Muslim Brotherhood as well as ISIS. Now I will do my best to answer your questions and respond to comments.
Thank you for that, Ralph. That was very informative. I guess we will move on to the next part. I just have a few questions based on the presentation. And while I'm asking the questions, for those of you, other attendees, if you have questions for Ralph, you could raise your hand or feel free to post your question to the chat room. So I guess my first question to Ralph is this: the timing is always interesting. So my question is, if this relations has been an open secret, but why now? Can you explain what motivated both sides to finalize the deal at this moment in time?
Well, I think, as I said, the Emiratis want the F-35 fighter jets. Incidentally, yeah, I mean, it's true. There is this relationship anyway. Interestingly, last year, there was a multi-country, I guess they were basically NATO plus allied countries were exercising over Greece, and Israeli and Emirati fighter jets were training together, were maneuvering together. But the Emirates, want those F-35s. This would help them get it, and the United Arab Emirates are more and more asserting a certain independence. They are allied to Saudi Arabia, but last year they withdrew from the Saudi coalition that was fighting in Yemen. So, they're sort of feeling their oats, I think. And of course, Israel doesn't need any special motivation to go for a peace agreement with an Arab country.
Okay. But on that note, on the Israeli side, how much of it do you think was driven by domestic politics? And I say that in light of, there being a multi-party coalition. Obviously, the Prime Minister is going through some sort of like a corruption scandal. And, let's not forget the pandemic. So how do those things play into how this deal came about? Well,
this has to be a feather in Netanyahu's cap. It has to help him. But, it's not an unalloyed triumph. As I mentioned, parties to the right of him are not overjoyed. I mean, they're perfectly happy having a peace agreement with an Arab country, but they would have to be very concerned about a delay in annexing additional West Bank territory. I mean, some of the Israeli politicians on the right, are so extreme that they really didn't like the Trump-Kushner deal, the Trump-Kushner plan. Of course, it's not exactly a deal. And the reason they didn't like the plan was because Trump-Kushner opens up the possibility of a two-state agreement with the Palestinians, even though it sort of leaves the possibility of a Palestinian, it looks like a Palestinian state that looks like Swiss cheese. So it doesn't look like a very viable or substantial Palestinian state, but even the very idea of a Palestinian state makes these people to the right of Netanyahu really upset.
Okay, thanks. Let's see, I see a lot of hands up, so we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. Let's go with, we'll try to go in order. So I see Ralph, then Ellen, then Art. So let's go in that order. So Ralph Chipman, that is. You're next. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, just a little elaboration on the U.S. role. I mean, Trump has been claiming this or the White House has been claiming this as a major success. And I guess the F-35s to UAE, did the UAE and Israel just not have their own interest for doing this? Was the offer of, I guess the U.S. offered F-35s to the UAE if they would sign an agreement, and was that necessary for achieving the agreement? Thanks.
Well, I don't know exactly. I mean, I think it motivates the Emiratis to go for an above ground relationship rather than keeping things covert. So it probably is an incentive. I'm sure they've wanted the F-35s for quite some time because they have an active Air Force, and they're concerned about Iran. So I mean, the F-35s are not meant as a counter to Israel. They're meant as a counter to Iran. Now, Israel is not overjoyed about F-35s going to an Arab country because they're concerned. Say there's a revolution in the Emirates, and you have a radical anti-Israel group that takes over, and they've got these F-35s. So it's not something they would be overjoyed about. I think the idea is they're trying to, the US would negotiate with Israel to say, look, they'll have the F-35s, but they won't be quite as good as your F-35s, because there are different kind of instruments and things they could do technologically. So, probably that would be okay. Probably that would juice the deal.
Okay, the next question will come from Ellen.
The Wall Street Journal covered this today. They covered the flight from Tel Aviv to the UAE, and that it was historic, and it flew over Saudi Arabia for the first time.
Right.
But I don't think I understand this issue with the F-35s, which was brought up in the article. Why does the UAE want these F-35s, and how long have they been trying to get them? Like, why is this a big point in this negotiation?
Well, I don't know how long they've wanted F-35s. I don't know how long F-35s have been in existence. But I don't think it's a mystery. I mean, this is a small country that's next door to Iran, you know, that doesn't trust Iran, doesn't like Iran, and vice versa. So it makes sense for them, a small country, to have a powerful air force, and the F-35 would be a great augmentation to their air force.
So as a follow-up question, do you think the external threats that they're experiencing, the UAE, is it mostly Iran that they're concerned about, or is it some other state actor?
Well, well, basically, as a state actor, it would be Iran, yeah. Now, of course, yeah, I mean, I guess they can't be too happy about the Russian presence in Syria. And of course, Hezbollah is allied with Iran, and, you know, they're all over Syria. But it's basically Iran. Iran is the motivator right now for all of these Arab Gulf countries, and you know, they have found common cause with Israel regarding Iran.
I had a question if nobody else is waiting.
Yeah, actually, just one moment, sir. There are other hands up, and looks like there was a question about how to use the hand-raising function. So what you do is go to participants, and if you right-click on next to your name, you should be able to raise your hand. But if you cannot follow that, just let me know, and you can post the question into the chat room, and we'll try to address your question. And there are some other hands, so we'll get to...
I guess you could put Rick on the list then, you know.
Oh, is that Rick? Okay.
Yeah.
So Rick, all right. So right now, we're going to go in order. Art, you had your hand up.
Yes, Ralph, first off, thank you for such a thorough breakdown of this recent deal and the dynamics of Israeli politics. If I can help answer a question, I think the F-35A started flying in 2006. So it's a new generation of fighter pilots, or sorry, fighter planes that Israeli pilots who are known to be very skilled, as well as Arab pilots who I'm sure would appreciate the training, would be able to utilize against Iran in the event that there was a war. And this is nothing new, where Israel has in the past attempted to block sales of AWACS radar planes to Saudi Arabia back in the 1980s. And there was always a sensitive dynamic between the Israeli lobby, friends in Washington, but nevertheless those who wanted to further Arab interests in the Middle East. I guess the comment / question I would have to Ralph and also the group is that an interesting figure in Israeli politics is Yair Lapid, who ironically was Netanyahu's finance minister in a previous coalition government. He's still a prominent figure in the blue and white coalition. And the fact of the matter is that the biggest domestic issue in Israel right now is not a conflict over a Palestinian peace settlement. It is over whether ultra-Orthodox individuals should serve in the military. And part of his platform was that ultra-Orthodox individuals who are studying Talmud should still have to serve in the Israeli military. They have been exempted for most of Israel's existence. Some changes have been made, but in general, if you study Talmud, you can vote to fight for the West Bank, but refuse to fight for it. And I'd be curious as to your thoughts as to how this gives Netanyahu cover, because my own comment would be the far-right party has nowhere else to go and has no choice but to support Netanyahu, which is why this deal was just so brilliant on their part.
Yair Lapid is a very interesting person. He's actually when I mentioned that when Benny Gantz, the leader of Blue and White, made the decision to go into the Netanyahu coalition, Yair Lapid became the leader of the half of blue and white that split away. So he's actually the leader of the opposition right now. Yes, he heads a party, Yesh Atid, we have the future, or there is a future, which main issue was curbing the power of the religious authorities in Israel, making Israel more secular. And yes, causing ultra-Orthodox who get this exemption from military service, getting them to serve in some capacity for national service, whether military or something else that would be of value for the nation. This issue is an old one now, and it's not on the front burner, really. I mean, the immediate thing is what's happening with the UAE, the coronavirus. There's been a resurgence. I mean, initially, Israel handled the coronavirus very well, and evidently they went back to more normal kind of existence too early, and they've been hit hard again. And now, when you combine the corruption charges against Netanyahu and the mishandling of the coronavirus, and maybe some other things, you have thousands of Israelis who are on the streets, demanding that Netanyahu resign. But anyway, but you're right. Yeah, Yair-Lapid is an interesting figure, but he is in the opposition now. Is there anything else that I could elaborate, or was there something, did I clarify things?
I guess the only clarification is, does this give Netanyahu the political cover he needs, because the right-wing parties really have nowhere else to go based on Yair-Lapid's hostility toward the military exemption?
Well, it probably, it probably helps Netanyahu. Yeah, I would say it probably helps him.
Okay.
Okay, let's go to next set of questions. I see hands up from Robert, then we'll go to Nirav. Hopefully I pronounced your name correctly. So Robert, Nirav, and then Kyle. So Robert, you're next.
Hi, yeah, I'm wondering, to what degree does this affect Hamas and other groups? I mean, are they now going to be driven even more into the hands of Israel, or not Israel, Iran?
Well, as I mentioned, the Palestinian reaction is very hostile, because it takes away this bargaining chip they had. You give us what we want in terms of a two-state agreement, and you'll have peace with the entire Arab world. Because that's not Hamas's line, because Hamas officially doesn't accept Israel's existence. So, Hamas is going to be hostile regardless. If the Palestinians in the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority, were in fact to engage in a peace process with Israel that seemed to have some possibility of succeeding. In other words, if in fact they met with Israelis who were inclined to give them a reasonable two-state solution, which is kind of up in the air as well, then Hamas might be kind of corralled into, you know, somehow accepting the possibility of coexistence with Israel. But as a principal value they have right now, it is opposition to Hamas. By the way, to Israel. By the way, the most pro-Iranian group, or the most, or the Palestinian group that's most supported by Iran is the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which is a pure terrorist group. Hamas, you know, they're a terrorist group in terms of the methods they use, but they also happen to be the governing party in the Gaza Strip. So it's a little more complicated, and you know, temporarily on short-term basis, they make deals with Israel. You know, they make ceasefire agreements. You know, they don't tend to keep them, but but there's a big problem in that Islamic Jihad has no incentive to even make peace on a temporary basis, because they have no governing responsibility. Their only purpose is so-called armed struggle. Yeah, I don't know. Have I answered your question? Okay, thank you.
So just along those lines, it seems like from the Palestinian side, this seems to be a bit of a betrayal, because once upon a time, they thought the interest that they had with the Sunni world was solidified. And now it seems like this could certainly be a diversion to a two-state solution. So can you talk about how this deal may impact the ultimate two-state solution, if that's what they're reaching for?
Well, it's not, well, I don't know. I mean, it's not particularly a step forward for the two-state solution, because here you have evidence that Israel could have normalized relations with most or much of the Arab world without having a peace agreement with the Palestinians. So that's kind of a disincentive. I'm of the belief that a viable two-state solution between Israel and a basically demilitarized Palestinian state that's not a military threat is very much in Israel's interest. And I think it's more in Israel's interest than any kind of further annexation or a maintenance of the status quo. Because if there is no ultimate peace agreement with the Palestinians, you have a de facto one-state condition from the Jordan River to the sea. And this, right now, you have more or less equal numbers of Jews and Palestinian Arabs who are in this space. And if the Jews lose their majority in their own country, then their security as a people in the Middle East is dubious, unfortunately, because the Middle East tends not to be very charitable toward its minorities. And of course, the whole idea of Israel is that in one place, Jews are not a minority, that they are in control of their destiny, because you know, whether it was in Europe or whether it's been in the Middle East or other places, over the centuries, Jews have not fared very well as a minority. Of course, okay. The United States is an exception.
Okay, let's go to Kyle. Thanks for patiently waiting. Kyle, you're next.
I thought I was next. No, I think Nirav was next.
I stand corrected. Nirav, you're correct.
That's right.
Nirav
Thanks.
and then Kyle. Sorry.
I just wanted to, I guess, return to the point you made about the F-35 fighters. My understanding was that this deal did not necessarily mean it's a done deal for the U.S. to sell those fighters, because there are, first of all, other rules beyond just diplomatic relations in order for that arms sale to occur, and it needs congressional approval. And related to that is what you said about the UAE feeling its oats in the Yemen conflict, where now it's effectively on the opposite side of Saudi Arabia in that conflict. And how much are you concerned that whatever arms sales occur would be used in that conflict as opposed to defense against Iran?
Well, it's not on the other side of the Yemen conflict, but are you hearing me? So I'm not seeing my box light up.
Yes.
Okay. It's not on the other side. It just withdrew from active participation in the coalition. It's jet pilots, its fighter pilots, and its soldiers are not involved in that conflict. They said, enough, we're not going to be there anymore. That's all. They still have friendly relations with Saudi Arabia. I'm sure that the Saudis were not happy about this, but you know, I don't think there's any really severe kind of break between the two. And you're right, of course. You know, F-35s just don't get passed around willy-nilly. They have to go through some processes, but the F-35 issue has been very important to this deal.
Thanks.
Okay, Kyle, you're next.
You had mentioned that this deal would get UAE taken off of the list of state sponsors of terrorism.
No, Sudan.
Oh, Sudan.
Yeah, if Sudan, well, Sudan is supposedly thinking very seriously about recognizing Israel. They want in on this too, and I mean, I think their foreign minister stated this recently. You know, you had a revolution in the past year in Sudan where this very Islamist dictatorship was overthrown. And, you know, we don't know how democratic Sudan will become, but anyway, hopefully they're moving in that direction. And they want in on, you know, the rest of the world. And if they continue to be on this terror list, it's not good for them.
And do you think that getting that designation removed would help with like restrictions on foreign direct investment or other, you know, economic factors that might be driving their desire to want to?
Oh, sure, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, let's go with the next set of two hands. Rick and then Yanis. So Rick first.
Yeah. Hi. Ralph, I had a quick personal comment. My parents worked in the UAE as expatriates, so I grew up there. That was many years ago. My question was, what are the signs, or what are your thoughts about the timing of this deal as it relates to U.S. foreign policy and appetite and ability to intervene militarily abroad, particularly in the Middle East? Because I was wondering if this is yet another sign of the world maybe moving on in terms of relying entirely on American military intervention to, say, contain Iran, and that's why the UAE picked now to get an important regional military ally like Israel on its side.
Well, I don't know exactly about the timing, except for the fact that you have an election campaign here, and of course, this UAE deal, in addition to being a feather in the cap for Netanyahu, is also a feather in the cap for President Trump. You know, that figures into the timing, I guess. And look, it makes good sense for the region not to want to rely on U.S. help. Trump is known not to be, you know, gung-ho on foreign interventions. Biden was also known to be more dovish in the Obama administration. He was on the other side of one or two foreign policy issues from Hillary Clinton. Yeah, look, it makes sense for countries in the region to find their own way to defend themselves. But of course, American technology is being part of this, and that also makes sense.
Okay, thanks, Rick. And let's go to the next person. Yanis, you have your hand up.
Yes. What do you see? You mentioned that Saudi Arabia is not happy about that deal, and I'm not exactly clear as to why.
No. I'm sorry if I left that impression. Saudi Arabia seems to be okay with the deal. What I was just saying is that they were not ready to make the same kind of plunge at this point. I think they're waiting to see what happens with the Emirates. The Emiratis are sort of the guinea pig here, because they're the first country in this neighborhood to make that step. You know, the Saudis are looking on and say, well, what's going to happen if they're putting their toe in the water? If the water's fine, say, you know, come on in. Then you know, it's quite possible that Saudi Arabia will pick up, but probably it will not be the next country to do that. Probably there'll be a few more, you know, at least a couple more before them, and it sort of makes sense for the Saudis to hold back a little bit, you know, just to be a little cautious.
And the reason for the caution is the Palestinian issue. Is there another geopolitical thing that makes them uneasy?
Yeah, well, look, Saudi Arabia has a very, very conservative clergy that have been very important in that country, you know, Muslim clergy. You know, to some extent, some of their preachings have gone into the creation of Al-Qaeda. You know, Al-Qaeda sort of has some origins with these ultra-conservative clergy. So the Saudis need to be cautious. And you know, when you come down to it, this is a potentially brittle system because it's still an autocratic system. You know, they've been able, the Saudi royal family, this huge Saudi royal family, because of how many children, you know, these people have had, how many princes there are, they've been able to maintain themselves because they're sitting on all this oil wealth. But the world is changing, you know, the world isn't as dependent upon fossil fuels as it was. People are moving away from fossil fuels. Plus, there are all these ideas in the world about, you know, change, and maybe countries should be ruled more democratically. And, you know, they made a big deal about the fact that, you know, women are allowed to drive, even though the activist women who pioneered in trying to get women to drive, you know, at least one or two of them are still in jail.
Women in New York don't drive, they take Uber, so I don't think that's so radical.
Well, that's a joke, but okay.
I'm being facetious, sorry. But the question with the clerics, do you think it could be connected with the Al-Aqsa Mosque and what Israel's plans are about, rebuilding, the Temple of Solomon, which happens to be on the third most holy site of Islam, which is the Al-Aqsa Mosque?
Well,
Does that play at all?
Well, it would play if that were a real plan. There are some Jewish religious fanatics and Jewish religious nationalist fanatics who would like to do that. In fact, talk about crazy. Their idea would be to blow up the mosques on the Temple Mount, and to build the third temple there, that would be a very radical step in the other direction. We're talking about a small but significant move toward normalization of relations with the Arab and Islamic worlds. Now, doing that and building this temple on, in the third most holy place in Islam would not be a way for that kind of relationship to proceed. Quite the opposite. And God bless them if they really want to go to war with 1 billion Muslims. Well, I don't want God to bless them, but it's just nuts.
The U.S. will fight that war. The U.S. will fight that war, not Israel.
No. Anyway, these are fanatics who believe this, and the Israeli government is not about to do this. Of course, some crazy things have happened in Israel. A prime minister who was one of the heroes of the founding of the state was murdered. You've had more right-wing forces coming to the fore in Israel than one would have thought. So I can understand, but that would be, that's like political science fiction, I hope.
You hope, that's the thing. That's why the U.S.
Okay.
On the
Let's
U.S.
go on
side,
to
I
some other
think
questions.
it's a little bit. The U.S. should be the force that stops such plans from happening.
Well, I hope the Israelis themselves stop it from happening. But let's move on.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
So somebody posted a question in a chat room, which countries will follow suit? And I think we've kind of established that Saudi is not quite ready to move so fast. And I think there's a reason for that. And I'll give you my kind of analysis, and then we'll kind of speculate on which other Arab countries to follow suit. Saudi Arabia is going through a great deal of economic uncertainty. I think they're really banking on the fact that, they could, succeed as a petrostate with whatever reserves are left. It's no surprise that, they kind of bet the farm on their national oil company, Saudi Aramco. And, they're hoping that, they could win the petro wars against other oil producing countries. In addition to that, I think, with this young leader, MBS, he wants to kind of, take the country's emphasis on as a petrostate away from, something that's more, modern technology and less reliance on fossil fuels. So it really remains to be seen, which steps they'll take to kind of transform their economy. Ralph has suggested that, yes, they do need to pander to their, what would be equivalent to the evangelical base, which is a very kind of extreme brand of Sunnism that exports Wahhabism and Salafism. And yeah, I think, if you were to make the connection, their brand of Sunnism gives inspiration to the likes of ISIS and others. So again, that's something that they have not really addressed as of now. And, Saudi politics domestically, it's very complicated because, they need to embrace that faction as well as trying to appear at least somewhat ostensibly modern. So I think that's kind of their dilemma at the moment. But I think ultimately, you know, if we were to just take a step back and look at the ideological battle that's going on between the Islamic world, it's really Saudi and Iran. And we've had many discussions about, you know, who will prevail if there is that kind of a zero-sum scenario. And Saudi is hoping that their brand of, you know, their brand of ideology will prevail. That remains to be seen. But I think a lot of these deals are a lot more than just, you know, two parties sitting down and working out a deal. I think this has a much greater ripple, and it has much greater geopolitical ramifications. And that's what really interests me in talking about this deal. So what about some other countries that might follow suit? Ralph, you had mentioned about Bahrain, Morocco. So can you talk about some of those other neighboring states?
Well, Oman and Bahrain are nearby. It sort of makes sense. And I had mentioned that Netanyahu had actually visited with the Sultan of Oman 2 years ago. I don't have a lot of insight into Bahrain, except that it's very much even more than the UAE allied with Saudi Arabia. And I said that Saudi Arabia is looking probably benevolently upon this deal. They just want to see, you know, that they have no reason to rush into this. I mean, ultimately, if it works and it expands to other countries, it makes sense for Saudi Arabia to do this. I mean, Saudi Arabia can only benefit from business relationships with Israel, Israeli technology. And by the way, to some extent, this is fueled as much as, you know, however we might think about Jared Kushner and the Saudi Crown Prince, MBS, they are supposed to be friends. You know, they're similar in age, and you know, and this all helps. This does help. Morocco, I understand that Morocco's interest. I mean, Morocco's been a somewhat moderate country regarding Israel. But its immediate interest in the possibility of actually normalizing relations with Israel is it's fighting for control of the Western Sahara with a group called the Polisario Liberation Front. I think these people might be Berbers as opposed to Arabs. And they've been fighting for their independent state in Western Sahara. Morocco would like help or support from whether it's Israel or the US or other countries in their fight, at least politically, maybe militarily, but certainly politically, in their fight against this secession movement. So that's part of their incentive.
Yeah, and I could just comment, having traveled to Morocco before, you know, a lot of their economy really is dependent on tourism. And in this post-pandemic era, you know, I don't think they could really bank on tourism being reverting back to what it was. So nations like Algeria, Morocco, I think they might need to find other means to expand their economic growth. And, you know, that means you need to, you know, make deals with your neighbors so that your engines of economy could be diversified and you're not just relying on tourism as the main source of revenue. Okay, let's go to some other hands. Let's see, Amber, you're next.
Sorry, actually forgot why I raised my hand. I think my question was going to center around like how what is like the end game, or like the like, is Israel making deals with individual Arab countries? Does that help their case around the world? I mean, how people view them, or is it really just they want to have economic partners? Because I'm not exactly sure. I'm not exactly sure how every time these peace agreements happened, everyone gets so, you know, hopeful, and they think that we've moved past a certain point, but there's literally a whole section of people who are not being recognized. And I just don't see how in the long term that it's helpful for Israel not to have any more like restrictions to force them to the table. So I'm just trying to think long game overall. Does Israel care how they look towards, like, from other people other than the United States? I mean, I ask this because, like, I remember, I think it was last year, there was that vote at the UN to recognize Palestine, and I was literally shocked. I mean, I kind of knew where my mom's country was going. I was literally spoke with the Prime Minister before they had he went his trip to the UN, so I knew what he was planning to do, because they were still a little upset about what happened with some aid that they sent to the Palestinians that got held up by the Israelis. So I knew where they were going to go, but I just didn't expect that like 138 countries would vote for the Palestinians to be recognized. So I'm trying to think, like, long term, how does this help Israel's image? You know, is this showing that they can, you know, work with other countries, and I mean, work with the Arab countries, and yeah, that's where I'm going. I'm rambling at this point. Sorry.
Yes. Well, any peace agreement helps Israel's image abroad, I'm sure. It doesn't resolve the Palestinian issue clearly. It may be, I suppose, if you have a domino effect, and a significant proportion of the Arab world normalizes relations with Israel without, short of a Palestinian agreement, that could put pressure on the Palestinians to be more forthcoming in their negotiations. It's, you know, I mean, I haven't been overly impressed with either side in terms of, you know, I mean, there have been periods when we came very, very, very close to a peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. You know, the point when Rabin was assassinated at the very end of a massive peace rally in Tel Aviv, they were on the verge of really going into serious negotiations for a Palestinian state. And then when, after Netanyahu's first term as prime minister, you had Barak going to Camp David with Clinton and Arafat, and their negotiations were very badly botched. But the intent really was for a two-state solution, and then that got unraveled because the Palestinians engaged in the Second Intifada, which was a very bloody affair. You had 1,000 Israelis killed. You had several thousand Palestinians killed. And that set things back for a number of years. And then there was another peace process under Prime Minister Olmert, who was originally a right-wing politician, and he had moved to the center. And he, in fact, came closer to a peace agreement probably than Barak did. And in the end, he got bogged down in Israeli politics. He had his own corruption scandal from his time when he was mayor of Jerusalem. And unlike Netanyahu, when he was close to indictment, he resigned. You know, he was caretaker prime minister for a while. They went into elections. Netanyahu was able to put together a majority coalition, even though he actually got fewer votes than his main rival, Tzipi Livni. Livni would have really continued the peace process. Netanyahu kind of didn't. I mean, he said he would, but it sort of bogged down. Also, Abbas has not been, you know, the Palestinian leader has not been stellar in his performance. You know, one of the obstacles that Netanyahu put in their way was he said, look, okay, Palestinian state, two-state solution, I'm all in favor of that. You have to recognize that Israel is a Jewish state. Now, he wasn't willing to do that. He said that would be a betrayal of Palestinian citizens of Israel. Now, if he went back and said, yes, Israel is the Jewish state that the United Nations called for in 1947 with the partition plan, and there was a recognition that Arab citizens would have full equality as citizens within that so-called Jewish state, that this Jewish state was not a theologically Jewish state, and it was not a totally Jewish state. It was just Jewish because it had a Jewish majority. So this fell through. You know, I'm doing a little bit of what I hoped I wouldn't, because you could go on and on with these permutations.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't. I'm not trying to make it like partisan, because obviously I'm biased. I have my own, you know, views on it. It's just that I just don't see anything to get excited about. You know, that's like just my thing. I mean, I feel like everybody trades with countries that they don't agree with all the time. So I just don't see why this is a big deal.
I think it helps Israelis feel that they are accepted in the region. And I think in the long term, this could soften their attitudes in negotiating.
If I could offer another analysis to address Amber's question, if I may. I think the positive spin from this is that despite, you know, many series of, you know, summits and peace talks, you know, the roadmaps for peace, there are some in the Arabic world that no longer looks at the US as a good faith negotiator in this peace talk. So therefore, sometimes, you know, when you keep doing the same thing over and over again, and you're not reaching any concrete results, then you have to, you know, change things up a little bit. So the positive spin to this is that by having this bilateral deal, you know, this could give way for other third party as a good faith negotiator to step in and try to get back to the negotiation table. Now, does that mean it's going to be the UAE that's going to step into the shoes of the US? Probably not. But I think, you know, given that there are deals with other Arabic nations like Jordan and Egypt, I think you could see how they could send a delegation and try to restart some of the deal. Now, those who put a positive assessment to this deal will say that, at least for the time being, you know, the further expansion or annexation into the West Bank was halted. Now, how much longer would that have, you know, been enjoined? I'm not sure. I mean, maybe it's just several months, but at least, you know, there's some room now to maybe start new talks. So I think if you're looking at it from a diplomatic angle, whenever any negotiation comes to a standstill, it's always good to have other third parties come in with some credibility. And I think that might help to kind of reignite the talks. So I guess that would be like the positive spin that you could take as a result of this deal.
Well, I really don't think the UAE has intentions to be any kind of broker for peace here. I think they're following their interests. And Amber is right that this doesn't particularly help the Palestinians. It's true. And I mentioned that you know, the Palestinians felt betrayed, and it's understandable that they would. But it might help the Palestinians if they understood that Israel actually needs recognition. It needs to know it's here to stay. I mean, I think they don't have much insight into Jewish psychology. You know, Jews are generally very aware of themselves as part of a minority group that hasn't fared very well, you know, from time to time. You know, that there are times when Jews are in peril, and that was certainly true in World War II. It was true before that. There was a mini Holocaust which occurred in the wake of World War I, where 60,000 to as many as 200,000 Jews were murdered in the Ukraine during the Russian Civil War period. You know, if not for the Holocaust, we would remember this as a huge event, but you know, hardly anybody does. You know, part of the big deal with Iran is that every week, you know, with the Friday prayers, you have these crowds shouting, "Death to the U.S., death to Israel." Now, why the heck should they feel this animus toward Israel? I mean, they're further away from Israel than the UAE is. They've never fought a war with Israel. And they have 10 times the population of Israel, and they have nearly 100 times the territory that Israel has. I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, I understand historically. I mean, Israel had a relationship with the Shah, but it isn't like Israel were the ones who were holding up the Shah. And it isn't like the only country that had a relationship with the Shah. Yeah, so, but you're right. The Palestinian.
It's not.
Go ahead.
No, sorry. That's not where I was going with it. I wasn't really thinking in terms of like what it being a bad deal for the Palestinians. I'm just talking about like world perception, because I feel like the world has now gotten exasperated with this relationship between Israel and the whole Middle East, and so there's like this loss outside of the United States. I feel like no one really cares, and not to belittle any points, but just like it's not. I remember in the 90s, that was all anyone was talking about. Like, we need to get Israel to be recognized by the Arab nations. We need to get a peace deal between the Palestinians. And that was like everyone's dream, everyone's goal. Is almost like world peace would descend on the planet if we got these two guys together. But now I feel like no one really cares, because it's just been so arduous on both sides, because the Palestinians didn't take olive branches that were given to them. The Israelis went too hardcore sometimes on some things. So it just got exasperating for everyone. And I felt like I really only that when that whole vote happened in the UN. And so I don't understand why I know that the U.S. still holds on to this. Like, this would, you know, if we could do this, if we could broker peace between the Israeli and the Palestinians, then, you know, we'd be better than everybody else. I mean, the people who started UK and France gave up decades ago, and they really are just, they don't really care. So I don't know why the US still, you know, holds on to this, and I don't see this getting any better, and especially not with like trade deals between two countries. That happens all the time. So that's where I was going with it.
Yeah,
but,
look, I think this new peace agreement is emblematic of what you're talking about. Large parts of the Arab world are getting tired of this conflict. And they're saying, look, we could benefit from normal relations with Israel. Let's do it. The hell with the Palestinians. So that is part of what's happening. You know, Egypt's motivation, you know, when Sadat went to Jerusalem in the 1970s and eventually made peace, I remember him saying something like, Egypt is tired of being the blood bank for the Palestinians, because Egypt was the major military power in the Arab world that was standing up to Israel. You know, basically because of the Palestinian conflict. And Sadat was saying enough of that. And you know, I think that's beginning to happen to other parts of the Arab world, where they're saying, you know, we can benefit from normalized relations from Israel, let's go for it.
And if I could offer my assessment on the Camp David Accords, and then we'll get to other members with their hands up. I think the times are different. You know, this is late 1970s, right? And sometimes I understand Amber being very kind of frustrated with lack of, you know, progress with these peace talks. Sometimes you need other world events so that, you know, those other world events or what perceived threats could bring about change. And I think if you look at the Camp David Accords, yes, you know, you had the world leaders come together and work out a deal, which was monumental. But I think from the US's standpoint, they were concerned about the Cold War. And let's keep in mind that Egypt flirted with communism for the longest time. And it was the US's worst nightmare for Egypt to then follow suit and go with the, you know, the Iron Curtain. So the US, to their credit, did everything they can to convince the Egyptian side to join the non-communist side. And so I think part of this is kind of like this global chess game. So, you know, sometimes you have to have other world events or certain tensions to kind of motivate other parties to come to the table and work out a deal. So I don't know what the other external tensions will be in this setting, but I think, you know, history will show that sometimes, you know, there's other moving parts that are taking place in the background, and that could also be used to bring about some kind of a meaningful alignment or realignment. So
in line with that way of thinking, you know, by the way, one of the things that propelled the Palestinians into a peace process with Israel in the 1990s was that the Soviet Union had collapsed. So their major backer had disappeared. I mean, not only was Egypt not on their side, but the Soviet Union, which had really kept them going, suddenly no longer existed.
good point. Okay, let's go to other hands. Let's go with Lorraine, then Nirav, then Kyle. Lorraine, you're next.
Okay, thanks, Ralph, for your presentation. I have a couple of specific questions. First of all, I just wanted to say, I think that when you negotiate around somebody and you don't include them, it sort of looks like a squeeze. And I don't think that sounds like it's in good faith. But I understand Thomas's point about try something different. But has the Palestinian right to return or any kind of compensation ever been on the table in these discussions, or is that sort of too far?
No, it was part of the discussions between Olmert and Abbas. which terminated in 2009. Part of what were called the Annapolis process, which started in 2007.
It's just that as time goes on, there are more and more, I don't know what that would apply to, but the numbers of people who would return, I imagine, are growing if they would come back with their families.
Well, there's not, there's not going to be a massive return.
Yeah.
There's probably not going to be any return at all, in fact. But when, 11, 12 years ago, when Olmert was talking with Abbas, they were talking about how large or small the token number would be. I mean, the principle would be humanitarian reunification of families. Mm. So people who had families in Israel, Palestinian Arab families in Israel, would be able to come, and that would be kind of a genuine return, because a lot of these people would have actually lived in Palestine, Israel, and were driven out. I mean, today you're talking about a return of generations who were not born in the territory. I was a big fan of a kind of an experimental peace agreement, which veteran Israeli leaders and some veteran Palestinian leaders had agreed to. They were out of government, so it was a very unofficial kind of thing. It was called the Geneva Accord, because they had some association with working in Geneva for a while. And they had an interesting formula for dealing with the right of the Palestinian refugees. And they said, look, in terms of a moral right, the Palestinians do have a moral right. But the practical issue is, how do you settle people so they can jumpstart or restart their lives? And in point of fact, the Israel that supposedly some would return to is a very different country than the one that their ancestors were expelled from. And those homes no longer exist. So as a practical matter, you have to think mostly in terms of compensation. You have to think in terms of monetary compensation. They were thinking in terms of an international fund that Israel and other countries would contribute to. And the idea would be that people who have official refugee status would have a choice. And part of that choice would be to remain where they are. But if they're in some Arab country or wherever, they should have rights of citizenship there. You have all these Arab countries which have not given them rights of citizenship. People in Lebanon, people in Syria, people in Iraq, and elsewhere.
Well, that's actually my next question, because I think most of them are in Lebanon. I could be wrong about that.
No, they're in a whole bunch of places, but Lebanon is a major place, yes.
Has there been any talks with Lebanon trying to normalize relations with the government there? And are there troops still in Lebanon, or are they not in Lebanon?
Troops?
I don't know. I used to work with a Lebanese guy who always referred to them as the occupiers.
Okay, well, Israel fought a war with the PLO in the 1980s, and they expelled the PLO from Lebanon. And because Israel outstayed its welcome, suddenly this new enemy arose called Hezbollah, who represented Shiite Muslims in Lebanon, and now the Hezbollah is a major military threat to Israel. But you had this terrible civil war in Lebanon, to some extent, the civil war was triggered by the armed Palestinian presence in the south of Lebanon, even years before Israel invaded. I mean, Israel invaded in 1982. The civil war broke out in 1975. Yes, that's right. And the civil war only ended in 1990, sorry. Now, what was your question exactly?
I was asking, actually, this person I worked with was saying this in 2008, so I'm not sure.
Okay, well, Israel's not the occupier in 2008,
okay.
but Hezbollah has a claim on a little piece of territory called Sheva Farms, which the UN actually considers to be part of Syria, part of the Golan Heights. Now, most of the Golan Heights is occupied by Israel. So you have these Lebanese Hezbollah fighters who are saying, oh, they're occupying part of our country. Well, the UN says it's not actually part of your country, but
okay, so
any excuse, if you want to keep on fighting, I'm afraid you're going to keep on fighting.
So Lebanon is not having any kind of relations with Israel in terms
No, there are no relations with Israel. One hopes that it could happen, but the most powerful party in Lebanon is Hezbollah, both as a political party and the fact that this is a political party that also has the most powerful armed force in Lebanon. The Hezbollah militia is more powerful than the Lebanese army.
Okay.
So Lebanon, you know, it's got problems.
All right, thank you.
Okay, we have time for 2 more questions. So let's go with Nirav and then Kyle. Nirav, it's your turn.
Thanks. I wanted to just have a question, but I just wanted to share a story I heard in the New York Times Daily podcast about some of the beginnings of this deal. And that was basically that this was before the time of COVID, where the UAE ambassador to the US was having a dinner with a Trump official and some reporters off the record. And they learned that Netanyahu was in the same restaurant, and they decided to kind of talk to each other. It was all unofficial, all off the record. But that was what led to things. And then afterwards, both parties allowed for it to be put on the record. It's the kind of thing where in the current state, you can imagine that informal diplomacy like that is much harder because those kinds of travel and dinners aren't happening.
Right.
Questions were relating to what you mentioned earlier about domestic politics, both in Israel and the US, where this is seen as a feather in the cap for both Trump and Netanyahu. But how much of an impact do you see that as being? Because it plays to their bases and might have some broader support, but will it change any minds? Like you mentioned that Biden supports the deal too, but I don't see like someone who's a Trump detractor saying, okay, Trump did this deal and therefore I'm going to start supporting Trump now. Similarly, you also mentioned a secret side letter as a way to deal with the problem of putting a term on the non-annexation of the West Bank. Do you see that as being sufficient? Like, would the parties accept it if it's secret, and if it's secret isn't in any way enforceable, because normally it would just be enforceable by the public? And did Netanyahu just create a bargaining chip for himself by announcing that he was going to annex the West Bank with no real intent of doing so because of the political consequences of that? So he gave away the bargaining, he used the bargaining chip that he created in order to get this deal for himself and have whatever potential domestic political impact.
I think Netanyahu was felt he was in trouble electorally, and he was grabbing at this straw. And it probably helped him. So I think that will happen. But I want to bring up something I could have brought up earlier, which is that, a commitment, whether private or public, by Netanyahu not to annex doesn't eliminate the problem, because what I heard was mentioned was that Netanyahu may want to give something to the far right in Israel by way of compensation. Well, we're putting off annexation for a while, you know, because we have other fish to fry right now. But what is immediately in the offing is the possibility of thickening the settlements in this area called E1, which connects East Jerusalem with the big settlement town of Ma'ale Adumim. And right now, it's basically just a road. Maybe there's a little bit of development there, but hardly any. And, you know, people who are very gung-ho about settling the West Bank, even if they would like to see a new partition with a very small Palestinian state, they do like the idea of Ma'ale Adumim being annexed to Israel. And they do have this notion of you thicken the connection so that really there's virtually no division between the eastern limits of Jerusalem and this big settlement town of about, 40,000 people or something. So there is a plan for anywhere between 3,000 and 15,000 settlement homes with some industrial support and commercial support in this E1 area. And that's without annexing anything. You know, so, you know, and I consider the settlement movement quite pernicious. I think it hurts the possibility of a peace agreement with the Palestinians. And I think eventually it hurts Israel, because Israel needs a peace agreement with the Palestinians. You know, it doesn't need it immediately, but it's going to need it at some point. So thanks for that story, by the way.
Yeah, no problem. Did you want to comment on the, I guess, the domestic political impact for either Trump or?
Oh, okay. Well, with Trump, you know, I think it's a potential, you know, when some voters might go through the pros and cons. You know, I mean, there are Jewish voters who are, you know, not very liberal, but, you know, very, very pro-Israel. Maybe they're not very right-wing, but, you know, a priority for them is Israel. You know, Trump's role in helping this new agreement with an Arab country and this brand new opening toward a major part of the Arab world, that might help those people decide to vote for Trump. Also, possibly even more significantly, would be evangelical Christians who are maybe a little bit upset about the way Trump behaves in some ways. And, you know, they're sort of going through, should I vote for him or not? And this would be a definite, okay, that's a check, yes, yes, that's in his favor. Yes, that would help me decide to vote for him. Yes. So yeah, I mean, I think it's marginal. I don't think it like wins an election, but you know, any little bit helps, right?
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you.
And if I could just offer the other partisan analysis, which is the Democratic Party. I did look at the party platform when they had the DNC, I guess, 2 weeks ago. And basically their party platform is unchanged from, the previous administration, which is, being a very staunch supporter of Israel. Of course, they want some kind of a two-state solution, but ultimately, the party position hasn't really changed much at all. So I think an interesting question is, does an average person in Israel, would they prefer to see a Trump administration or a Biden administration? And I think a lot of this is perception. And my guess is that they would rather see a continuation of the Trump administration.
Yeah, I would agree. Most Israelis whom I know actually are Democrats, but or further left. So they're not happy with Trump. But most of my relatives, I think, these are also Israelis whom I know, my relatives, are probably quite happy with Trump. The idea of this great country, this great supporter of Israel, moving the capital to Jerusalem and whatever else. I mean, they probably really like the guy. I don't think that's a very sophisticated analysis, but I think it's very understandable.
Okay. We have, let's see, a hand up from Kyle. Kyle, go ahead.
You talked about the peace deals with Egypt and Jordan that actually have worked and sustained themselves for quite a while. So what were the aspects that worked, and how did they compare to this new one?
Egypt had an interest in getting back all that territory. And it also had an interest in no longer being at war with Israel, which was not very constructive for them. If they had won any of these wars, I suppose it would have been, but they didn't. With Jordan, ultimately, I feel bad about Jordan because actually there was a secret alliance between King Hussein of Jordan from the early 1970s up until the point where the peace treaty was signed in 1994. And when Rabin and King Hussein showed up at the signing ceremony, they had this little chatter together, and they said, now, when was it that we first met? And they were talking about going back to the early 1970s. Like they had known each other for a very long time. And, we even have on good authority that on the eve of the 1973 war, known as the Yom Kippur War, King Hussein flew his own helicopter into Israel, trying to warn the Israelis that the Syrians were massing to attack. And, it goes to show that there was a relationship. And I think, in fact, the Palestinians would have been better off if the Jordanians had taken back the West Bank, and if Egypt had traded the Gaza Strip to Jordan at the same time. And there might have been some border modifications, say, in Jerusalem and elsewhere in favor of Israel. But, I think there could have been a three-way peace agreement which would have prevented a Yom Kippur War, a peace agreement between Israel, Egypt, and Jordan. We're still suffering for that, for that not having happened.
So I guess kind of tying it into the current one. So what are the components that you think will cause this one to potentially last, as opposed to?
Well, they look. The UAE has never really been at war with Israel. You know, I think they can both benefit from commercial relations and from, you know, technology and whatever else. You already have a body of business people in Israel and the Emirates who know each other. They already have relations. You know, it makes sense. It's not a key to peace in the region. It's not a key to, you know, Ambre is right. You know, it's not a key to peace with the Palestinians, but I think it's a positive good in itself.
So I guess my kind of takeaway would be anytime when you have any nations within one region come to the negotiation table and work out a deal, even if those two nations are kind of far apart from one another and they don't share like an adjacent border, I think it's a net positive. Now, obviously, you know, you got to look at the details to scrutinize and see, you know, how much this would, you know, bring about certain real change. But I think, you know, when you have, you know, I'm just using another example of Greece and Turkey. Again, you know, they've been, you know, contentious disputes over, you know, the island of Cyprus. But I think if they are able to come to some kind of negotiation table without resorting to any military escalation, I think we should embrace it. And, you know, let's see what happens. And I think the more you could have multi-party talks as a result of a negotiation, I think that's always a net plus. So I think we shouldn't minimize these talks because it's just, you know, symbolic, you know, effort, or it only works for the domestic consumption. It could very well be, but I think sometimes, you know, these agreements or deals, they have like a life of their own, and it could really offer opportunities to at least sit down at the table. And I think that's really important. Ralph, do you have time for one more question or no?
Sure, one more, sure.
Okay, so there's a hand up from Giannis. Go ahead, Giannis. Last question.
Yes, I cannot help but comment on the last point you made about Greece and Cyprus, Greece and Turkey, and it ties also with Israel and Palestine, because this idea, oh, let's talk about it, only favors the party that has the strong position. So that's a pro-Israeli position, and that's what Israel has been doing. It's been buying itself time to strong arm the Palestinians into subjugation. And it's obvious from this deal that that's what they are trying to do, and they said it explicitly. Okay, and I don't think it's going to work because the Palestinians have realized that they have no benefit to subjugate themselves. It's not noble, and they're not going to do it. Now, my question though has to do with the December 2016 UN Security Council resolution that Obama famously, by abstaining, allowed it to pass. That resolution renders illegal any territories that Israel has acquired since 1967. What's the importance and the weight of this resolution in the negotiations and in any territorial acquisitions that Israel has made or will attempt to make?
Well, if the sides agree, that is, if the Palestinian Authority or whatever duly constituted Palestinian Authority there is, agrees in the context of a peace agreement to have a swap of territories with Israel, I think that still works. And I think that is a key to a solution here. It is still true that something like 80% of the Israeli settlers in the West Bank are within 4% of the territory of the West Bank. In other words, they are still within a small outcrop, relatively small outcropping of Palestinian West Bank territory. It is not at all inconceivable that Israel could come up with a comparable amount of territory to trade for that. And I think it would be in the interest of both parties, that is both peoples, to make that trade.
Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else? Final thoughts on this deal before we wrap it up? Art, you want to add something?
Yeah, well, real quick, we've talked about a very intriguing topic, which is the Israeli-Palestinian relationship and a potential solution. But I suppose my point on all of this is, are we missing the point? Isn't this more about Iran and Saudi Arabia and Israel and the Gulf states cooperating to isolate Iran and in fact pick a side in the Sunni-Shia conflict? Because for years I've heard experts on the Middle East say that the real battle is not between Arab and Jew or Muslim and Jew, it's between Muslim and Muslim.
Well, that's a lot of it. And, you know, I have mentioned that's really the background of this, because these Sunni Arab powers have had a covert relationship with Israel for quite a while. And yes, it's being fueled by their mutual concern over countering aggressive Iranian behavior in the region and their threat, yes, because they are all threatened by Iran, it's true.
Sure, and if I could comment on that, again, if you look at a bigger picture, it's ultimately, I hate to put it this way, but you know, in the Islamic world, they wanted to see which brand of the ideology prevails. And each side is convinced that their brand of Islam is the pure and the right version of Islam. So their job is to basically decimate the existence of the other brand, not decimate completely, but they want to, eventually influence the other side. And that is kind of their act of ideological caliphate. So,
look, if I may say, you've had several internal explosions. I don't mean physical explosions within Iran, although you've had those too. But I mean political explosions of mass opposition to the Iranian regime. There was a mass outpouring in 2009. There was an even larger massive protest movement last year. And the Iranian regime is not popular. And one of the things it's not popular for is these foreign adventures. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps is engaged militarily in several conflicts, and they're sustaining casualties. And the Iranian people, many Iranian people, probably several million, were saying, look, we're not doing well here. I mean, we have the Trump sanctions against us. Our economy is in the toilet. You're wasting money abroad as well as our blood. Let's stay home. Let's do something here. So my hope is that one of these days, this opposition and unrest, which is internal will change the regime and will settle the region, you know, because in the end, you know, the Sunnis are not going to triumph over the Shiites. They're not going to wipe them out. And the Shiites aren't going to wipe out the Sunnis. You know, you have to have a peaceful resolution eventually, or at least an agreement to live and let live. You know, so, you know, saner minds have to prevail, I hope.
I just want to point out a comment that was posted in the chat room. It says, the Sunni and Shia divide was manufactured by the Western powers. Right, no kidding. I think if you look at pretty much all the major conflicts that we have, it's a product of what happened at the end of World War I. So I don't think the Sunni-Shia divide is the only exception. You could go through every corner of the globe and whatever geopolitical tensions there are, sure, these are the consequences when you have a world event. So that's a no-brainer.
Thomas, I think that's a little too facile. I just think, you know, there's been this tremendous schism within the Islamic world, which comes from the earliest generations of Islam. It comes from the split within Mohammed's family. I mean, you know, they haven't always been at each other's throats. That's true. I think in this case, it was the fact that Iran was taken over by this radical Shiite theocracy. and I think they really create, well, you know, and the Sunnis, of course, have their own, you know, their own radical Sunni version of theocracy. You know, you don't need the United States to get them to fight each other. I mean, you don't need an external force to get them to fight each other. I mean, they've been doing this, but yeah, I mean, look, the United States and Britain are not totally blameless. I mean, you had, I think, was a democratic reformist government in Iran that was overthrown by the CIA and the British in the early 1950s. And that was what the Iranian revolutionaries kept on talking about, you know, going back to. And this pushed them into the arms of these radical Shiite clerics who made this revolution. And you know, so in that sense, okay, the U.S., the West had a role, but the conflict was really there. It's sort of, you know, I mean, I'm sure the U.S. and the Brits didn't go around saying, well, let's divide the Arab world. Let's make this religious conflict between them. I don't think they did.
They did that to India, so I wouldn't put it past them.
I don't think they did that to India either. I think it happened. I don't think they did that to India.
If you ask, well, all the people that I know feel that way. There was no disagreements between the Hindus and the Muslims pre-colonialism. They all lived together in one big country and did not fight at all. So all of a sudden now you split them up into 3 different countries and tell them, you know, this person's better than this person, or this, I can work with this group, but I can't work with that group. That seems pretty much like you're starting a problem that wasn't there. Every place that the UK has gone, they've done that.
You know, the Muslim League, or was Ali Jinnah, he was dissatisfied with the Hindu-dominated Congress Party. Whether he had legitimate grievances, I don't know. And that that created, you know, the Pakistani movement, which created Pakistan. And you had this terrible exchange of populations on the road and these people fighting each other. You know, whether the Brits created, you know, whether they did all they could. They probably didn't do all they could to stop it.
They
but
chose a side and they gave one more legitimacy than the
but
other.
which side did they choose?
They chose the Indians. Well, they chose the, I forget what the name of the group was, but it was like a, you know what, let me.
If I could just interject, we're almost running out of time, and that's a whole nother subject. It would be a disservice to bring it up and then not be able to, you know, discuss it further.
Yeah.
It's an interesting subject. We've talked about India-Pakistani conflict quite a bit. But on that note, if I could just mention the next discussion we're having, we are going nuclear for the next discussion. That being the, right, that being the NPT on nuclear weapons. And believe it or not, you know, these nations, Pakistan, India, we talked about Iran, you know, they're either nuclear powers or nations that are aspiring to be nuclear powers. So that will be the next discussion this Friday. Our friend Ali is going to lead that discussion, so it should be interesting. I guess on that note, does anyone else want to say anything about this Israel-U.A.E. deal before we sign off? I know Ralph's going to get annoyed by this question, but do you believe Jared or Trump should be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize?
No, because I don't think it was very hard work, and I also, you know, don't think this is a key to lasting Middle East peace. I think it's a good, small, positive step. And, you know, I hope it's increased. Look, I don't think that Obama should have gotten this Peace Prize when he did. I mean, you know, we know he didn't get it because he did anything particularly. It was because people were so glad that he had taken over from George W. Bush. They were anticipating great things, so they gave him this prize. And, you know, I think he should have respectfully turned it down. But I think that Jared and certainly Trump would not turn it down if they were offered.
I think the prize was supposed to be aspirational. Maybe it's
exactly.
But from what you've said about and the point that Art made before, it sounds like a Democratic win for the presidency could change the dynamic dramatically with Iran and with the deal and with the internal problems that Iran is having, et cetera, et cetera. So,
well, it gives the possibility of a new round of a nuclear arms agreement with limitation agreement with Iran. You know, a problem with the last agreement was that it only addressed nuclear development, and it did not address Iran's aggressive behavior in the neighborhood. And I know the Iranians insisted. They said, "Look, we'll you know, curtail our development, nuclear development," and they would say, "Oh, when we don't want to bomb anyway because, you know, it's anti-Islamic." But you know, it was a problem because they were still a problem in the region, and so you had all these enemies of the deal for the reason that it was not a complete deal. But I think it was a net positive because it really was delaying the possibility of a nuclear bomb for a bunch of years.
mm-hmm.
You know, I also wish it didn't have any sunset provisions in it, but it did.
Okay. All right, folks, we have to, oh, Mikhail, you want to say something? Looks like you're on mute.
You're on mute.
If next administration is Biden's one, I still can't imagine they would go back to the same agreement for two reasons. First, it's already went too far kind of to make it less popular, at least domestically. And secondly, I believe what Mossad found within Iran, all these huge source of documents showing that Iran was cheating while negotiating and implementing the agreement, I believe it negates everything which was decided in the agreement. So if there will be any, it should be completely or almost completely renegotiated, in my view.
Well, yeah, I'm inclined to think it would have to be renegotiated, you know, and I think it's, you know, I can't predict, you know.
Right, yeah.
Okay, thank you for that point. I guess we will wrap it up. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ralph, for a wonderful presentation. I learned quite a bit from all this. And I guess until next time, take care.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ralph.
Good
Thank
night.
you, Thomas.